Tonight with Andrew Marr.
Good evening. Now, I really hope this doesn't sound self-indulgent, but I have been analysing myself. Am I easily distracted and forgetful? Yes, afraid so. Do I find it hard to organise my time? Well, ask any member of my family. Do I find it hard to follow instructions? My team of excellent colleagues here at LBC would give a hard yes to that. Do I lose things like wallets and mobile phones and keys? Well, no more than several times every day. Restless? Yes. Very talkative. Interrupt conversations. Well, what do you think I'm doing here? As you may have guessed, I have been on the NHS website and diagnosed myself and, drumroll please, going down the official checklist, it is crystal clear that I suffer from ADHD, Attention Deficit Hyperactivity Disorder, and there are drugs I can get for that. Except, as you may also have guessed, this is all, in my case, absolute bunkum. I am an ordinarily chatty, forgetful, and slightly irritating man, just as I was once a chatty, forgetful, and very irritating boy. This is life. Now, obviously, there is a huge spectrum, and other people could tick exactly the same boxes, but describe problems which crippled them through everyday life. But I think this is important to talk about tonight, because today the Health Secretary, Wes Streeting's, announced an inquiry into the overdiagnosis of mental health conditions, including autism and ADHD. According to the NHS, 1 in 4 adults are now diagnosed with a mental health condition. In England alone, 8.9 million people are on antidepressants. That's up 2 million in just a decade. But this is not just about the pills. A lot of these people are dropping out of work entirely. There are now 4.4 million people of working age claiming disability or incapacity benefits. Now, some are old-fashioned ill, in a terrible state, wheelchairs, unable to communicate at all, intense pain. Others aren't like that. I don't think we should be blaming people for acting rationally. If you have a problem which interferes with your daily life, and there are pills which can help you, take the pills. But there is a wider question. Are we over-diagnosing, over-medicalising parts of the range of normal human experience? Wes Streeting is right to be asking it. And I'm going to start tonight by talking to a woman who produced the new gold standard diagnoses for autism, Professor Catherine Lord, the American psychologist and researcher. Professor, thank you very much for joining us tonight. Can I ask you to go right back to the 1970s, when you started to look at children with what we now would say had autism, describe the symptoms you were saying and describe the atmosphere, as it were, surrounding that?
I think in the 1970s, autism was a last resort diagnosis. So most of the kids that we saw were not able to talk and were much more handicapped and intellectually disabled than today, where we realize that autism can occur in someone who is quite bright and quite competent.
You, in your work in the 1980s and beyond, have helped expand the range of things that we call autism. Do you look around now and see the number of people who are either being diagnosed or sometimes self-diagnosing as autistic or indeed ADHD and think it's gone too far, too wide?
I think we see both things. So we still see kids who have misdiagnosed when they actually do have autism. And who haven't gotten a diagnosis, but we also do see people struggling for an answer when they have ordinary life problems and are hoping to have a simple word that would explain them. And I think that is of concern.
Professor Lord, let me ask you what seems to me to be the hardest question for an outsider, which is clearly something has happened. Millions and millions of people are getting these diagnoses now. Have we changed the human race in the last 20 or 30 years so that something that wasn't prevalent before is now? And then there's a question about why, if that's the case, or are we simply describing differently something that's always been around?
I think it's always been around. So I think maybe life is different now. I mean, the expectations for people to manage huge amounts of information and to use technology and to work harder, not physically, but mentally, I think is different. So I think there are more demands on people's time, and that we are seeing pushback about, wait a minute, I can't do this. Whereas somebody 100 years ago might not have been able to say that, or might have been more accommodated.
That's really, really interesting. So if we're talking about ability to organise, if we're talking about concentration and memory, then the technology we are all surrounded by may be part of the story.
I think so. I think it makes things harder. We're all dealing with just much more information and an expectation to how do we prioritize that information and make sense out of it.
The medicalising of this, and therefore the ability for people to ask for welfare help as well as medical help, has increased enormously. As somebody who is part of that story, do you look back now and think this is becoming a social problem that's been bigger and not something we expected at the time?
I think that is true. I don't think we expected it. I do think that we have to remember that there are as many people who haven't gotten a diagnosis, who need one, as there are people who are searching for an answer, and maybe autism or ADHD isn't really that answer, but they're looking for it. So both happens, but I would hate to emphasize just the overdiagnosis when we still have people that don't get the support that they need as well.
And for people who might maybe right now in their adult lives never having had a diagnosis and feel that something is going wrong in the workplace or with their relationships around them, and are looking for help. Do you believe that the drugs that are now available for ADHD and autism are good enough to make huge differences to many people's lives?
Well, in ADHD, medication can make a huge difference. In autism, there really aren't medications. So it really has to be adjustments in expectations and what people are doing. So I do think it's worth people trying to get help. But I think that we want thoughtful help, not just an automatic label of you have this, go get, resources, but thinking through what will really make a difference.
What will make a difference? That's a very good place to finish this really interesting conversation on. Thank you so much, Professor Lord. And I think it's important with stories like these to speak to people who have first-hand experience of what it's like to live with conditions such as autism or ADHD, which is exactly what we're going to do now. First, with the wildlife television presenter Chris Packham, who has autism and who made the programme Inside Our Autistic Minds. Chris, thank you very much indeed for talking to us. Can I just ask you, first of all, to explain to people listening what it feels like to be autistic?
Well, I think the experience is very different now than it was during my childhood in the 1960s and 70s, when that condition was not more widely understood. And it was far more challenging for me as a young person to exist in society, to fit in and complete my education and manage my own mental health. And what I hope is that going into the future, where we now have a far broader understanding of this condition and the way that it impacts upon people's lives, that we can develop a wider understanding in society so that we are able to facilitate, comfortable, successful education for young people, and so that they move through their lives and they're able to be fruitful, productive, happy, and healthy. And that doesn't always come at an enormous cost to our health service. So whilst we welcome an independent, scientific-based investigation to this that Wes Treating has announced today, what we also fear is that we're still looking at a situation where young people are not sufficiently supported, and therefore, when they're looking at waiting times of perhaps 4 years for a diagnosis in the most formative part of their life, they can still be, essentially, disabled from being able to fulfill that education and therefore find a fruitful role in later life.
Chris, I think that I may be wrong. I think you were diagnosed as an adult.
Correct.
Can you tell people listening what were the problems when you were a child that caused all this difficulty? And again, what did it feel like emotionally for something going wrong that you weren't able to understand?
Well, that was the principal problem, Andrew, the fact that I wasn't able to understand and identify why I behaved differently than other people. And as a young person in the 1960s and 70s, not being able to relate to and integrate properly with my peers, struggling within an education system which was actually very supportive in many ways, down to individual teachers that I very fortunately had. I was able to navigate my way through that. But, I am one of those people that I have to say that, and you mentioned this in your introduction, that I can see advantages to my autism as well as challenges. But of course, I'm fortunate in that regard. It's a spectrum condition, and some people are confronted by far more challenging aspects of autism than I am.
What were the specific problems, Chris? Was it an inability to concentrate, to make friends, to look people in the eye, and
yes, I mean, on a day-to-day basis, and these are some of the things that self-management through that lack of diagnosis until I was an adult, meant that I was able to concentrate on, and eventually they've become habitual. You and I met recently on a TV program, and I didn't struggle to make eye contact with you. At a certain point, I will recognise that I'm actually making eye contact with you, and that's because it's almost switched. It's inverted because it's become so habitual for me that I no longer have to concentrate on that. But then sometimes I can be consciously aware of the fact that actually what I'm doing is something which is calculated rather than natural. But in terms of what we're looking at here in terms of that, the implications for health, I think that what we should be doing is analysing why there is enormous, pressure on those neurodivergent people. So neurodiversity is a biologically important thing. The fact that we're physically different, and the fact that we are neurologically different is an inbuilt survival mechanism for our species. So that's clearly something which is advantageous. But when it comes to neurodivergent people who manifest these differences, the easiest way to deal with that is to ask for a broader societal understanding through education, work, colleagues, friends, family, so on and so forth. And sometimes that can come at little cost and impact to our NHS if people are simply better informed. And that's why, myself, the BBC are making programmes like Inside Our Autistic Minds. Yeah,
so when you hear from the Health Secretary phrases like overdiagnosis or over-medicalising the problem, do you think that's something that worries you, or is that something that he's onto something genuine there?
No, it does worry me. It worries me because I hear it from other parties who are less understanding and who are more reactionary. And I fear that once again our government is knee-jerking to satisfy part of a community which is suspicious of these things. But what I welcome is the fact that if this is a scientifically based, and that's how we should make best informed decisions based upon real evidence as we know it at the time, then that is something that Mind, the National Autistic Society, and people like myself will be supportive of. But ultimately, we have generations of young people and adults too that are exposed to pressures that you and I didn't have as children. We were not constantly, bombarded with information and challenges that come through social media and other pressures in our life. So when we talk about overdiagnosis, when it comes to a mental health crisis, we have to accept that the world is constantly changing. It's a dynamic place. And I'm not surprised that young people now are struggling with their mental health in a way that you and I weren't asked to do so when we were young.
Chris, I'm sure that is a big part of the story. Thank you very, very much indeed for that. Now let's speak with Matt Gupwell. Matt has got an ADHD, and he's an advocate and mentor who's been sacked from 30 of the 35 jobs because of his ADHD, which he was diagnosed with, again, as an adult. Matt, thank you very much indeed for joining us again. As with Chris Packham, could you explain to people what your experience of ADHD has been like in the workplace and perhaps in the family as well?
Well, let's start with the workplace. As you rightly said, between the age of 18 and 36, I amassed 35 full-time salaried jobs and was sacked from 30 of them. And I always say when I give talks, I quit the other 5 because I felt I was going to be sacked.
Can I just ask, sacked for what?
I was sacked for disorganisation. I was sacked from 2 jobs because I couldn't keep a manual A4 diary in order. And when you're running bookings for a large hotel's conference centre, that really doesn't go down so well. I was sacked because I would be seen as argumentative. I would be seen as fractious. I would be told that I wasn't very good at taking direction, but left to my own devices, I was incredibly creative and I was a wonderful people manager. So a lot of the time it was sacked because of what might be called a lack of fit.
You were a round peg in a series of square holes, as it were.
Oh, very much so, yes. And the thing is, I didn't know why. And that's why it was difficult.
So when you got your diagnosis, what did it mean for you, both in terms of your daily life, but also how you understood what had happened to you before that?
It's really interesting. So when I actually got my diagnosis, it was on the back of a severe nervous breakdown. I was struggling with suicidal ideation at the time. I by then had had my own business for a number of years. On the outside, it all looked rosy. Behind the scenes, I was falling apart. And at that point, the diagnosis was, for me, what I felt would be life-saving. And you've already mentioned medication. I felt that if I could access medication, it would change things. It would make my ADHD go away. And the reality is that's not what medication does. That's not what it's for. But like so many people seeking diagnosis as adults now, because the education and the information that comes when we're researching and when we're being assessed isn't adequate enough. And this was very much brought up in the NHS ADHD Task Force report. That leads to people not knowing quite what to expect. I was looking for answers, and it's genuinely taken me a number of years since diagnosis to understand myself. And that, for me, is at the heart of why this announcement today is really quite troubling. And I have to admit, I'm very confused by it, given the information in the NHS task force, which almost wholesale contradicts what the tone of this statement is, that there isn't overdiagnosis. People aren't being over-medicalised. In fact, there is a gross underdiagnosis, and access to medication is not as high as it should be. So it's really strange that the two are so juxtaposed.
Matt, I think that's a very important warning to everybody listening, particularly in politics. But for now, thank you very much indeed for talking to me. Coming up, Nigel Farage held a dramatic and at times bizarre press conference this afternoon. Our political correspondent was there, and she'll be with me to give us all the details, but you are listening to Tonight with Andrew Marr, and the time is now 6:19. Life for Reform, Britain's party of the rebel right, is never boring. This week, they've been able to announce the biggest ever single donation to a party from a living supporter, 9 million quid from the tech entrepreneur Christopher Harborne. But they've run up against polling, which suggests they may have reached their limit. And that came after damaging reports about Nigel Farage's remarks about foreigners and Jews when he was a schoolboy. Then came a newspaper report that Farage wanted a merger or pact with the Tories before the election, something he vehemently denied. Today, the party used a press conference, and LBC's political correspondent Aggie Chambre was there at it. They used a press conference to do what, Aggie?
Well, Nigel Farage started off this press conference talking about how abhorrent he found it that the government had decided to delay 4 mayoral elections. So he talked about that for a few minutes. And then he said, Reform UK have been in the news quite a lot. So basically, we've got loads of journalists here. Ask whatever you want. And he went first to the BBC. And I think, Andrew, that is noteworthy because often in these press conferences, they don't go first to the BBC.
And this was because the BBC and The Guardian and other papers have very much focused on remarks he made as a schoolboy. So in a sense, it was what Tony Blair used to call the masochism strategy. Get out there in front of your critics and face them up as quickly as possible.
And I think that's right. And he definitely, well, at least it appeared that he had prepared what he was going to say to the BBC. So these accusations first emerged in The Guardian newspaper a few weeks ago. The newspaper had spoken to more than 24 of Farage's schoolboys peers. And one classmate said that Nigel Farage would come up to him and say Hitler was right, and he'd say, go gas them. And other classmates talk about alleged incidents of deeply offensive behaviour by Nigel Farage too. Now, Farage has previously denied the allegations. He said he never directly really tried to go and hurt anyone. But today, on the Today programme on the BBC, his deputy went one step further and alleged that school peer was lying. He said, I think this is made up twaddle by a whole bunch of people. And so the BBC correspondent asked if Farage would say the same.
The double standards and hypocrisy of the BBC are absolutely astonishing. At the time I was alleged to have made these remarks, one of your most popular weekly shows was the Black and White Minstrels, right? The BBC were very happy to use blackface.
Now, Nigel Farage referencing to British sitcoms there that were deeply offensive in the 60s, 70s, 80s. And he did the same with an ITV reporter who asked questions, and sort of the ITV reporter was trying to ask these questions. He sort of kept saying over him, Bernard Manning, Bernard Manning, Bernard Manning. And so it sounded like he was sort of saying that...
We were all like that back then.
Yes. So I did ask as well, Andrew, are you basically saying that, it was a different time, that you need the context to be able to understand this? Because what he wasn't doing during this press conference, and indeed didn't do, was say that he agreed with Richard Tice, who had said that his schoolmates were lying. He did not go that far. He did say at one stage to The Guardian that recollections may vary. But this has been seized on by the Labour Party and by the Tories. The Tories actually saying Farage just called a press conference, used it to rant at journalists over historic allegations of racism and anti-Semitism, allegations he has just admitted are true. Now, he didn't admit it was true, but he did not go as far as Richard Tice did this morning on the Today programme.
That's very interesting, yes, because this comes at a time, Aggie, we've talked about this already before, where reform seemed to be kind of peaking in the polls, and according to some polls recently have been coming down a bit. Now, Luke Trill, the pollster, said, I think last week, that he thought that was partly because we're now talking about the economy, and the more the political conversation is about the economy, the more reform struggles. But it may also be connected to these allegations that we've been talking about. So the question is about Nigel Farage himself. He is both a very, very popular leader for a lot of the country, but also extremely divisive and disliked by other chunks of the country.
Yes, and I couldn't work out exactly what his strategy was at this press conference, because it seemed that he had pre-prepared what he was going to say to the BBC and perhaps ITV too. Reform UK have kind of clipped up his response to the BBC too. So perhaps he's trying to kind of get ahead of that, to have a go at the BBC, and that is the strategy on this. But I think it is difficult territory for him, the fact that at the moment he is not saying these schoolmates are lying. He did produce a letter that he said he'd received from one contemporary, which basically said, it was a different time. And he said he had 5 other letters like this, but he wouldn't say who had sent these letters. Said basically he didn't want journalists to kind of go after these people, I suppose, interview these people.
He doesn't want this story to run for too long in its original form. Did he talk at all about the other big story around reform, which, I mentioned the big donation, that's very good for them, but also this suggestion that he told donors that he wants some kind of pre-election pact with the Tories?
So he didn't specifically talk about that, but the other story that came out as kind of part of that was that senior Reform UK figures had been suggesting to him that he should poach Robert Jenrick from the Conservatives, and that was something I asked him about.
The Jenrick question cropped up in an article in the Times that popped up, to my surprise, last night, which basically said that people within Reform were advising me that I should reach out to Robert Jenrick. And I get people in Reform urging and advising me every day to reach out to sporting figures, to reach out to business figures, to reach out to media figures, to reach out to political figures. And have one or two suggested I should reach out to Jenrick? Yes, they have, because they believe that his conversion from being the Remainer Robert Jenrick to being what he is today is a genuine one. And I don't know, but if it is a genuine one, I'd be more than happy to talk to him.
That's really interesting because, of course, Robert Jenrick was the guy who came up against Kemi Badenoch in the leadership thing and failed, and has made a thing, and particularly on social media, of being highly critical about multiculturalism and immigration, and sounding a bit, quite reform. He's also, I think, the person who suggested in the past, in a leaked recording that it was important to, quote, unite the right and get some kind of arrangement between the Conservatives and reform of an electoral nature.
Yes, and that's interesting too, because Nigel Farage and people close to Nigel Farage were sort of suggesting yesterday, look, the Conservatives are dead, as we talked about on your programme, and we want to kill them even further. But I should say, I have, Robert Jenrick did say on a programme earlier, it wasn't very long ago, I was running to be leader of the Conservative Party, so I'm not going anywhere. And there was also, as part of this Time story, they said that Robert was kind of downbeat, and a source close to him has said, that's rubbish. They said, I wish he was downbeat. He's wearing the team down with his constant ideas for his next campaign. He genuinely enjoys his brief. It's hard not to have fun opposing Calamity Lammy. Talking there about David Lammy.
I mean, I think it's fair to say, Aggie, there are Conservative MPs or ex-Conservative MPs who want to join Reform, that Reform don't terribly want to have on board, and there are others they really would like, and Robert Jenrick is probably top of the list.
Yes, and I don't think they've exactly worked out what their strategy is on Tory MPs joining Reform UK, or indeed ex-Tory MPs joining Reform, because it is a tricky line, because they don't want to just look like the Conservatives Mark II. They want to look different from that. And also, I think they're trying to work out whether they would allow Conservatives who've lost their seat to then stand as Reform MPs. I spoke to one MP who said, look, it's case by case. We don't want people who've just lost their seat to then think that they'll get an easier ride with Reform UK.
People will say sometimes when we have these conversations, why do you keep talking about Nigel Farage and Reform? They've only got 5 MPs. The answer is that if you look at today's polls, and they haven't shifted that much, they would win the next election. And they're a very, very potent source. And we had this guy, a tech entrepreneur, who's given them £9 million, which is a record for a living donor. And Reform are now beating both the Conservatives and Labour by a mile in terms of the amount of money that they're raising. And this matters, does it not? Because we've got all these elections coming in May, and it will give them a freedom and a punch the other parties won't have.
I think that's completely right. And I also think, we started today talking about these allegations against Nigel Farage from when he was a schoolboy. And I think it's important to cover that, as well as covering the good news for Reform UK about them getting this absolutely huge donation, as well as the fact that they are being extremely critical of the government over the delaying of those mayoral elections. So yes,
that's 4 mayoral elections in England, which they think they would have won all of, but have been delayed, I think, for 2.5 years because of council reorganisation.
Yeah, so they're delayed until May 2028. So new mayors were expected to be elected in Greater Essex, Norfolk and Suffolk, Hampshire and the Solent, and Sussex and Brighton in May next year. Now they're going to wait until May 2028. And Nigel Farage is fuming, basically said in this press conference, we would have won all of them. So that is why they are so angry.
They're very angry. They're often quite angry. Aggie, thank you so much for that. Coming up, one of our greatest thinkers, Steven Pinker, will join me for a fascinating conversation. You don't want to miss it. But the time now, 6:31, and Amelia Cox has your news headlines.
LBC.
6:33. The assassination attempt on the former spy Sergei Skripal in March 2018 in Salisbury was authorised by the Russian President Vladimir Putin, an inquiry has concluded. The Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, agrees with that. He called Putin morally responsible for the death of Dawn Sturgis, the British woman killed after she sprayed herself by mistake with a nerve agent smuggled into the UK by Russian agents. Let's hear now from Neil Basu, the former senior Met police officer who led the anti-terror investigation into the Skripal case. Neil, very good to have you on the show. Are you surprised that this, according to the report and the Prime Minister, goes all the way up to President Putin himself?
No, I'm not surprised at all. I mean, we knew that from the early stages of the investigation. As soon as we had identified the assassins involved and realised that they were GRU military agents, and of course the third person who was coordinating their activities here, it became obvious that this was a GRU-led campaign that used a murder weapon, which was, an incredibly dangerous weapon of mass destruction. There's no other way of describing a perfume bottle that can contain enough Novichok to kill 10,000 people as anything other than that. Well, that doesn't happen on foreign soil in the way that it happened without sanction at the very, very highest level. So it was always our working assumption that this had been sanctioned at the highest levels of the Russian government.
And when you were doing the investigation, did you at the time feel that this was an act of war?
Well, I've used that expression, and that's a political judgment, and it was for the Prime Minister to make. But I certainly know that we all sat around in rooms in Whitehall and at New Scotland Yard thinking, my God, I mean, this is what it looks like. Why on earth has this been done in such a dramatic and brazen fashion on UK soil. I mean, this, a nerve agent hasn't been used. No chemical weapon had been used on European soil since World War II. So it certainly had the makings of that. And of course, any response had to be very carefully considered by the UK government. I think in the end, it was that government, that particular administration, and Theresa May's probably their finest hour in terms of galvanizing 20 other countries to support them in the action that they took.
Because the other thing that the inquiry said that was this was intended by the Russians to, as it were, show what they were capable of, to make a statement to the world. And if there is a criticism at all, it's that it was always possible that Novichok was left somewhere around Salisbury by the Russian agents. I get the impression that the reason that people weren't told about that was simply that it would spread too much panic. The idea that it was a nerve agent in a very, very heavily populated area would have been too much for the public to cope with.
Yes, and it wasn't just that area. I mean, look, the criticism is fair. I think it's fair for the inquiry to come to that criticism. I would just say that having been the decision maker at the time, it was an incredibly difficult decision for Counter Terrorism Policing to make. What we were trying to do was to protect the public as much as we could by finding out wherever the suspects had been and wherever any trace of Novichok had been, that we managed to seal those areas, recover the evidence that was required to try and catch and convict these murderers, and then have the area cleaned up. When it became obvious that they had travelled widely, from London airports into London and out to Salisbury and back again, you were talking about cars, trains, planes, other areas of the country. At what point, what do you close down and at what point? I will say this, when the chief medical officer came out with what I thought was a brilliant piece of advice after Dawn Sturgis was killed, so too late, if you didn't drop it, don't pick it up, was the kind of simple advice that I think we all wished we had said at the start.
That's really important. Thank you very, very much, Neil Basu, for that. Fascinating. Professor Steven Pinker is simply one of the most respected thinkers in the world. He's the author of books such as The Language Instinct, How the Mind Works, and Enlightenment Now. He is, broadly speaking, an optimist, and he's just published his latest book, When Everyone Knows That Everyone Knows, about how we really communicate with one another. He's in London at the moment to give the George Orwell lecture at the South Bank Centre, and he joined me this afternoon. I asked first why his understanding of the concept of common knowledge mattered.
Common knowledge is the state where I know something, you know it, I know that you know it, you know that I know it, I know that you know that I know it, and so on ad infinitum. Now that sounds impossible, but we have a sense of common knowledge when something is public or blatant or self-evident or out there, when it's said aloud, when you can't miss it, when you see something and you see other people seeing it. And that changes everything because it's the basis of our social relationships. It's also the basis of our political and financial understandings, but it's the basis of our friendships, of our romances, of our transactional relationships, of our relationships of deference. They exist because both parties know it exists and each one knows that the other one knows it.
So if I say the word Trump, there's a whole cloud of assumptions and images and memories and ideas associated with that. If I say the word Trump to somebody who I know is a strong anti-Trump supporter, it means something different to saying the same word to somebody who is a MAGA supporter.
Yes, there is a common ground of shared assumptions that makes relationships possible. And often sometimes we avoid generating common knowledge. That is, even though we both know something, we don't make it public so that neither one can be really, really sure that the other one knows it. That's the basis of politeness and hypocrisy and euphemism and innuendo. Sometimes we just blurt things out where we both convey a message and we make it known that we share the assumptions of the other people. That can be liberating at times, but it can also be nerve-wracking.
A good example of that I think we've had recently is this government's decision to lift the two-child cap on welfare payments so that families with more than 2 children get full welfare in a way they didn't before. Now, behind that argument, it's not terribly popular in the country because a lot of people think that members of religious minorities, particularly Muslims, perhaps Orthodox Jews, have more children, and that therefore they are subsidizing those people, and they're also subsidizing, quotes, feckless people who shouldn't be having as many children. And that was something that a lot of people kind of thought was the background of the argument, but nobody in politics would say it out loud.
Cancel culture, political correctness are examples of things that can be privately known. Everyone kind of knows what the implications of this policy might be, but it can make a big difference if you make it common knowledge by blurting it out, because that changes your implied relationship. In this particular case, perhaps a relationship of superiority or dominance, who's your friend, who's your enemy. All of these things can be changed when something is blurted out, but they can sometimes be preserved, even if everyone knows it, as long as everyone does not know that everyone else knows that they know it.
And what we call cancel culture is in practice very often self-censorship, because people are worried about what other people will think of them saying something. How dangerous is this in a culture?
We depend on a certain amount of inhibition, self-control, just to have our day-to-day relationships, our friendships.
We don't go around being rude to people who just greet you.
Yeah, you don't say everything you think in a friendship, in a marriage, in a family. But there are some spheres in which you really do have to get everything out on the table. That's the whole point of these institutions, like the legal system, like government, like science, where they're in the business of finding out the truth, even if the truth is rather awkward. And when we carry over our everyday social norms and sensibilities from our intimate relationships into public institutions, that's where they can sometimes be trouble.
Is it a coincidence, you think, that as people more and more self-censorship in their day-to-day relationships because they're worried about different groups and different attitudes around the place, more and more people are going to therapists to say what they really think?
Oh, that could be. I suspect more and more people are striking up relationships with artificial intelligence because they don't get rebuked by ChatGPT.
That's really, really interesting. You're making a big speech at the Orwell Foundation this evening. Can you give us a taster or a preview of what you're going to say?
The title is 1984 and 2025. I will pose the question, how much did Orwell's prophecy come into being? He, of course, denied that it was literally a prophecy. He said it's a satire, it's a warning, it could happen, not that it necessarily will happen. So I'm going to ask the question, did it happen by 1984? And has it happened even more so since then?
Well, we're talking about totalitarian surveillance states. We certainly live in a world of much more surveillance. But do you worry that your own country is going towards a slightly more totalitarian political atmosphere?
Well, I like to quantify things, and there are organizations that score countries on their degree of democracy, and we've definitely been sinking. Actually, the UK has sunk a bit too. Still much better than most other countries, but the direction is concerning.
And is that because of restrictions on free speech? Is that because of the use of the courts to go for people who say things online the state doesn't like?
Yes. I suspect that the reason that the UK's rating on the liberal democracy scale has sunk is because of things like the non-crime hate incidents, where snitches can prod the government into investigating, which is a form of punishment, even if they have not committed a crime on the law books.
Well, we've had the Graham Linehan case. You may have followed the Irish comedian who got into a lot of trouble.
Yes.
Is it a good thing that this is what we argue about the whole time?
I mean, it's good that we're arguing about it as opposed to just accepting it, and that's a major reason why we're not living in the world of 1984. We can argue for it right here on the airwaves.
You have, in the past, investigated cancel culture and the so-called woke culture and the way we communicate. In all your investigations, do you emerge basically as an optimist about the civilization we're sitting through?
Of the civilization in the long run, yes. It doesn't mean there aren't concerns that we have to worry about now. The reason that civilizations improve is that people are sensitive to setbacks and problems as they arise and try to push back against them or try to solve problems. So I myself don't think that don't consider myself an optimist just because I've documented many of the improvements in life. We're richer, we live longer, we're freer than our ancestors were. But one of the reasons we enjoy all these is that when there have been threats to freedom or to peace, we are aware of them and we push back against them.
Because you have in the past very vigorously defended the idea of enlightenment and liberal human progress, including on things like longevity and human health. And you got a lot of pushback from that inevitably, but you remain an optimist. You remain a believer in a sort of one-way direction of enlightenment.
Well, I don't believe in anything you have to believe in. So, and I don't consider myself someone who just sees the glass as half full. What I do is I try to look at data and trends rather than headlines, because headlines can give you a misleading picture of the state of the world. Something goes wrong every day. That's guaranteed. And if you just look at something goes wrong and say, oh, things are getting worse, you might be forgetting all the things that went wrong in the past.
And what we call the news is a long litany of all the things that are getting worse or going wrong.
Well, yes, it's much easier for something something bad to happen suddenly than for something good to happen. Good things either creep up on you a few percentage points a year and sometimes can compound. So the fact that, for example, that extreme poverty in the world has been declining and 1 billion people have escaped extreme poverty over the last 30 years, but not on Thursday. So it was never an event in the news. So one of the biggest events in human history is something that most people have never even heard of.
We don't talk about the slow increase in alleviating poverty, but we get very excited when an iceberg breaks off a chunk of the Antarctic, as it were.
Indeed. And of course, that's the way the human mind works. We're impressed by anecdotes and narratives and images and episodes. But one of the gifts of being in a more scientifically sophisticated society is that we do have data. And so we can detect things that are improving, that are invisible to the naked eye.
Just coming back to this new book, which is, as I say, about how we communicate with each other, the words we use, I found a quote which says, you say, rational argument should be really more like a dance than a war. Just explain to people what you mean by that.
Yes, so this is an implication of a famous theorem on the phenomenon of common knowledge. That is the difference between everyone knowing that everyone knows something and everyone merely knowing it. But the implication is that rational arguers, when there are two opposing positions and they're trying to determine the truth, there's no reason that they should compromise and end up halfway between them. Who's to say that the truth just happens to lie halfway between what two guys believe?
It might be with me and not with you. Or vice versa.
Or vice versa. Also, why do we think that the metaphor of war is the most appropriate way to settle on it? I attacked his position, but he tried to defend it, but in the end, it was a crushing defeat. Is that the best way to arrive at the truth? According to this theorem, a rational style of argument, this is hard to believe, would involve the two sides sometimes switching their positions, sometimes lurching in one direction and then to another, before finally coming into agreement, as rational agents ought to do.
So more like a dance, more like a pirouette that lands somewhere.
Yes, and sometimes there's some kinds of argument that actually work that way. So mathematicians standing at a whiteboard trying to determine whether a theorem is sound or not will sometimes switch positions, and one of them will be passionately arguing for what he was attacking just a few seconds before, since their goal is just to get at the truth. This is a standard of what rational argument should be, assuming that the argument is designed to get at what's real.
It sounds like LBC on a good day. Professor
Yes,
Steven Pinker, thank you very much indeed for coming in.
Thank you.
Another eventful week, another political panel. I'm joined by two of the most top-notch journalists in Westminster next, but the time now, 6:49.
Night with Andrew Marr.
It's 6:51, and this has been a week dominated by the aftermath of the budget and questions about the future of both the Chancellor and the Prime Minister. A huge overhaul of the court system and hints that we could move closer to the EU. I need some really shrewd and experienced help in crawling over all of this, so my weekly panel, I'm delighted to say, is Gabriel Pogrund, the Whitehall editor of the Sunday Times, and Camilla Turner, the political editor of the Sunday Telegraph. Welcome to you both. Let's dive straight in. In the aftermath of the budget, there has been a lot of muttering about the position both of the Chancellor and of the Prime Minister. Gabriel.
That's right. I think if you speak to members of the Cabinet or MPs, the mood has changed. At first it was a sort of subtle evolution of language, but from the autumn into the winter now, that there is sort of unusual thing within the Parliamentary Labour Party consensus, which is that something is going to happen. It's not going to be imminent. We've got to wait till the expected reckoning come local elections. And the real question now is, when Starmer is challenged, who is it and what are the means? What's the mechanism? It's less. There aren't that many people who can make a compelling case, or who wish to make the compelling case for Starmer sticking around indefinitely.
Staying where they are. Camilla, I'm really interested in all of this, obviously. But first of all, there is the question of timing. Gabriel was saying wait until May, and that does seem to be the consensus. But there's quite a lot of people, including in the Scottish Parliamentary Party, who say we can't, because we'll get such a drubbing then that we won't recover from that.
That's absolutely right. I think there is a bit of a debate, and the debate isn't, as Gabriel just said, the debate isn't whether to get rid of the Prime Minister, it's when, the timing of this. On the one hand, there's a school of thought that says if you move against Keir Starmer and try to get rid of him before the May elections, what message does that send to all the hardworking Labour councillors who have been, they're the kind of the ground troops? Does that just completely throw them under the bus and make their chances of being elected even worse because you've got a Labour National Party in turmoil?
And then there is the question of what actually happens, because there are people who think, if somebody like Wes Streeting came along and had an alliance with, shall we say, for the sake of argument, Angela Rayner, you could have such a huge move of Labour MPs towards them that there wouldn't be a contest. It would be nasty, but it would be quite quick and quite effective. However, the bigger likelihood probably is there is a contest, and that could go on for weeks and months, and the country would just say they're like the same bloody Tories all over again. Here we go, and we hate this.
That's right. And I think, by the way, that is the one thing that does militate in Starmer's favour, which is that, I don't think out in the country, far be it from me to say exactly what it is that people out of West W1 think, but I don't think there's enormous appetite for regicide. But and also Starmer, should be said, has bought himself time and goodwill with respect to lifting the two-child cap. We know this was Starmer likes to use the phrase, I have in my mind's eye X, Y and Z. Well, he had in his mind's eye the mushy middle of the Parliamentary Labour Party, and from John McDonnell all the way to Lou Haig and the people who were once upon a time behind the rebellions that so tormented him over the summer. They are now saying, well, actually, to be fair, if you look at the letter of the policy, they're not wholly unhappy.
And that's fair, isn't it, Camilla? Of the various audiences the Chancellor had at the budget, one of them was clearly the Parliamentary Labour Party, and that is probably the single most positive response she's had.
Yes, absolutely. And it was very interesting listening to that budget, sitting up in the press gallery, and it was so noticeable that the basically the only time the Labour MPs showed any positive sentiment was during that lifting of the two-child benefit cap.
Waved their order papers,
a rapturous roar of content from them. So that clearly went down very well with them. Whether that went down so well with the rest of the country is another matter.
Business and the public much less so. Looking at the polls, looking at the reaction that Labour MPs are finding on the doorstep and going to be carrying back to Westminster again next week, it's gone down quite badly so far.
Absolutely. I mean, the main message the government were trying to push in that budget, and the Prime Minister hastily called a press conference to try and continue pushing that message just a couple of days later, was, we're helping everyone with the cost of living, the money off the electricity bills and the rail fares. But fundamentally, if people's taxes are going up and everyone can feel that in their pay packet, that message just doesn't really land and people don't buy it. People aren't idiots.
I think that's right. And I'd also say, I was speaking to people in the Treasury weeks ago who were saying that the NHS would be, at the centre of this budget. And in the end, they preserved the capital allocation enshrined in the spending review of the spring, which, we needn't get into the spending review now, but basically they, confirmed what they had already announced. I think that there is generally a bit of deflation in the value of language with respect to this administration, where you can, roll the pitch for something and then say that press conference never happened and we didn't mean what we said we meant, and we're going to do these big things for the NHS, but in actual fact, they've perpetuated the status quo. So I think it was sort of the reason we ended up focusing so much on the two-child cap was because there wasn't
much else
rounded offer beyond that.
Absolutely. If we're looking anywhere for a bit of kind of optimism and light as far as the Labour Party and the government's concerned, it's outside that. It's what's going on the right of politics, with this argument between the Tories and Reform about whether they will do some kind of pact. And on the left of politics, what happened to poor Jeremy Corbyn's party launch last weekend. So let's just reflect on a little bit of life outside Labour. Camilla.
That's absolutely right. I suppose the one thing Labour can bank on is that they're not the only party at the moment who are in chaos. You've got Farage and his kind of endless battles with the Tory party, and there's a sort of a new scandal emerges every week, and that's a whole area. And then separately, the Your Party big founding conference, which also was a bit of a flop in many ways. There
won't have one leader now, and it's not the kind of leadership structure Jeremy Corbyn wanted.
Exactly, and they're sort of beset by infighting. They've had some of their few MPs already leave, so it's not all sunshine and rainbows elsewhere on the political spectrum. However, obviously Labour, as the party of government, you would expect them to maybe have their house in order a bit more than the other much smaller parties.
Gabriel.
Yes, well, I mean, your party business, I mean, it's provided a bit of levity and light relief to those of us, talking about the darkening fiscal picture in these politically difficult times. I mean, I think the one thing I would say, I reported earlier in the summer, I was, on the receiving end of much opprobrium from many lefties for having claimed that Corbyn resisted. I was so angry about the launch of this party that he'd refused to endorse it, and his wife was urging Zahra Sultana not to announce. I mean, at the time, there was lots of scepticism as to why that would make its way into the hands of Sunday Times
Gabriel, you were wrong at the time. It was even more chaotic than you thought.
Exactly. And actually, I did say a couple of weeks ago that I was hearing rumours that Sultana could be banned from the conference, but in the end she banned herself. She boycotted it. Yep. The only thing to say is I actually think that the left is not that bit of the left is less balkanised than we think. I think that basically the Greens are just eating their lunch already. It's not quite the same where Kemi's actually doing a bit better on the right and complicating things from Farage's perspective.
Zach Polanski is on the march. Gabriel, Camilla, thank you both very, very much. What a week. Let's hope next week is a little bit quieter, but it probably won't be. Anyway, if you missed any of today's show, you can listen back on our free Global Player app or the new LBC app, where you can stay up to date with all the latest news and opinion. You can put your news categories in the order you'd like them. You can pause, you can rewind live radio, and you can listen to a range of podcasts. Download the all-new official LBC app for free from your app store now. Coming up at 10 on LBC, it's Ben Kentish, but right now, it's time for Ian Dale.
Thanks, Andrew.
The situation is so grave.
From sporting or entertainment events